100 years ago, the largest train robbery in U.S. history happened a few miles east of Libertyville, Illinois. More than $2 million in securities and cash were stolen. The plan seemed flawless, yet all the culprits were captured, tried, and sentenced in just under 6 months. Established in 1955, the Libertyville Historical Society, an all-volunteer organization, collects and preserves historical material and information relative to the Libertyville area. The 1878 Ansel B. Cook home, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, is home to the Society's archives and museum. Our guest speakers for this presentation are Jenny Berry and Pamela Krueger. Jenny Berry is president of the Libertyville Historical Society and the local history librarian at the Cook Memorial Public Library. Pamela Krueger is a 28-year Lake County resident, member of the Libertyville Historical Society Board, and a volunteer docent at the Ansel B. Cook home. And with that, please enjoy the presentation.
Once again, thank you so much for being here, and we're happy to have this opportunity to present on the Rondout train robbery. So before we get started, a quick note on the sources for this presentation. The information to be presented tonight has been gathered from a variety of materials, including news articles, many contemporary, some from several years later, either recapping the crime or when somebody involved got in further trouble or died, court documents, and extensive interview transcripts with 2 of the 6 men convicted of the crime. Now, due to the nature of reporting at the time and criminals' potentially nebulous commitment to truth-telling, even under oath in testimony, combined with the century that has passed, we feel a definitive account of events is difficult to construct. Conflicting information persists about some of the details of the crime. So we're going to present the events as they seem most likely to have happened based on the sources we have consulted, as well as let you know where contradictions in the sources may exist. And the story of Rondout train robbery that we're telling you today includes some verbatim excerpts from some of contemporary newspaper coverage. And the newspaper reporting from a century ago reflects the area's journalistic style, social norms, and language, which we feel helps to create an intimacy with the time period. Now on with our story. The Rondout train robbery took place in the middle of June, 100 years ago. In the early days of June 1924, local and national headlines detailed the gruesome murder of 14-year-old Bobby Franks by Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. The country was nearly 4.5 years into the Volstead Act. Prohibition added illegal brewing, distilling, and distribution of beer and liquor to local mobsters' usual rackets of prostitution and gambling. And on June 12, 1924, the same day that future President George H.W. Bush was born, a gang of thieves stole somewhere between $2 and $3 million from a mail train headed from Chicago to Milwaukee. Headlines about the robbery and the hunt for and arrest of the perpetrators took over local and national newspapers. The plan seemed flawless, yet all the culprits were captured, tried, and sentenced in little under 6 months. But to us, the story of the Rondout train robbery reminds us of a drama or a silent movie that plays out in multiple acts. So we're going to present it as such. With that in mind, let's first meet the players. Headlines the morning after the heist reported that at least 25 armed men staged a holdup. But actually, there were only 6 men at the scene that night who stopped and robbed the train. 2 of the bandits, Willis Newton and his brother Jesse, boarded train number 57, known as the Fast Mail, at Union Station, riding blind baggage, which means they stowed away unseen, while 4 more men waited in stolen Cadillacs for the train to arrive in Rondout. Waiting in the getaway cars were 2 more Newton brothers, Doc and Joe, along with bank robber Brent Glasscock and former cowboy-turned-criminal Herbert Holiday. The Texas-born Newton boys were best known for their bank heists, and I actually had the opportunity to visit one of their banks on a recent trip to San Antonio. They had done a few previous train robberies, but those generally featured stealing money and jewelry on passenger trains. Glasscock was a valued non-family member of the Newton gang. The brothers relied on his explosives expertise to blow safe doors off during their midnight bank raids, which allowed them to grab money without putting bystanders in harm's way. And there isn't a lot of available information on Herbert Holiday, but he appears to have been a lifelong criminal. Now, despite the extraordinary planning, skills, and luck required to rob banks and passenger trains without getting caught, The scale and scope of this mail train robbery was so far beyond the Newton gang's usual heists that investigators immediately recognized the brothers must not have acted alone, and they didn't. The Newton gang had a Chicago connection named James Murray. According to news reports, Murray's various professions included former Chicago policeman, beer runner, and would-be politician. He was known as 19th Ward Jimmy because he served as a henchman for Alderman John Powers, whose war with a political rival from 1916 to 1921 left 30 people dead in planned murders. And now let's meet the lead investigators. First, we have Lawrence J. Benson, Chief of Police for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Rail Line. He spearheaded the railroad police investigation of the robbery. Then we have William Shoemaker, Chicago's Chief of Detectives, who directed the Chicago police in the manhunt. And finally, William Fahey, who led the investigation for the Postal Service. Now, the first thing that may come to mind when you hear the phrase train robberies is Wild West bandits riding up next to a train on horses in the late 1800s. But train robbery was still alive and well into the 20th century. And in fact, in 1921, in his annual report to Congress, the Postmaster General noted that there had been a, quote, sudden and unusual increase in crimes committed in the holdup of railway mail trains and mail messengers, etc. And in the previous year, there had been at least 36 mail robberies across the US. And locally, a year before Rondout, the Chicago Daily Tribune reported that there had been a number of mail robberies here, and the government sent its best men to stop them. Their best men included William J. Fahey, a postal inspector who came to Chicago in 1920 after serving in the same role in Philadelphia for 3 years. He had been adamant about increasing the mail clerk's ability to protect both the mail and themselves. He implemented firearm and target practice for the mail carriers. He also installed an alarm system in the post office and changed mail dispatching processes to prevent mail from theft by clerks. He was known to roam the stations at night, watching the mail transfers. And he understood how the mail was a target for robberies, having served as a mail clerk for many years before being named a postal inspector.
Act 1, the heist. So we've met the principal actors, and now we'll get into the part of the story. June 12th, 1924 was a Thursday. On Thursdays, the fast mail train, train number 57, always had more money and valuables on board than any other day of the week. Still, for the mail clerks, the engineer, and the firemen, it was business as usual on the 11-car train as it pulled out of the Union Station on a warm, humid night on schedule at 9 p.m. The train was expected to reach Milwaukee by midnight. Here's an example here of what it looks like to ride blind baggage. This is an excerpt from a 1911 Popular Mechanics photo, and it shows just 2 possible ways they could have ridden in this way without being seen. The 70-person team, that's one of the notes that we saw, was a 70-person team manning the train, had no idea that 2 men had snuck on board before the train pulled out of Union Station. So a note about Rondout. Rondout, Illinois was the robbers' destination, originally known as Sulphur Glen. The hamlet was supposedly renamed Rondout when a business from Rondout, New York, considered moving to the area. The business never came, but the name stuck. Rondout was annexed by Green Oaks in 1994. At the time of the heist, 3 railroads intersected here. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul was the first to the area in 1872. Before the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul extended into the town of Libertyville in 1880, the Rondout Depot, also known as Libertyville Junction, was the closest station. The Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern Railway completed track through Rondout in 1890. And the Electric Railroad, later known as the North Shore Electric, opened an extension from Lake Bluff to Libertyville in 1903. So in 1924, when all of this happened, Rondout was sparsely populated and home to a smattering of just a few businesses. The 1922 city directory lists fewer than 70 adults, the majority of them either farmers or employed by one of the railroads. There was a post office, a general store, a school, and at least 1 saloon. So not a bad location to pull off a train robbery if you want to go unnoticed. The 2 stowaways hid between the coal car and the first mail car for more than an hour. As the train engineer blew the whistle announcing the approach to Rondout, The bandits climbed over the tender and into the cab of the locomotive, covering the engineer and the fireman with their guns and telling the engineer exactly where they wanted him to stop the train. The brakes went on, the train slowed down. The jolt staggered the mail clerks in every car. Willis Newton later described the moment. Jess grabbed the fireman and I went for the engineer. When they looked around, I had my gun on him. He threw his hands straight up and went to hollering. I said, I want you to stop this train at that 2-mile crossing up there. But he was just scared to death and kept his hands up there, and the train kept running. I wanted him to stop right on the crossing because our cars were right there, but instead he run past the whole train length. Willis made the engineer back the train up. 4 other members of the bandits gang were waiting near Buckley Road in recently stolen automobiles. As the engineer and fireman dropped from the cab led by the 2 stowaway bandits, a band of men swarmed out of the darkness and began shooting their firearms. Some carried sawed-off shotguns, others carried revolvers. The abrupt stop was the first sign any of the mail clerks had that something was going on. Some threw open their train car doors to see what was on the tracks that forced the train to screech to a stop. Their curiosity, which was blended with alarm, played into the hands of the bandits. As they peered out into the darkness, they found themselves under the gun. Each robber had a flashlight. Brent Glasscock waved his spot of light along the trackside. To his surprise, it flecked across the figure of a man standing near the track, half hidden by small trees and brush. He fired his gun 5 times and the figure went down. Roy Roach, who was a railway postal clerk in the 3rd train car, described what he saw in his testimony. He said there was a sudden flash and the glass in the door crashed down. There was a hard knock. My fellow mail clerk, Trotton, opened the door. Someone outside said, come on out and keep coming. We piled out. There was a man on each side of the door and both were carrying pistols. Another man said, we're out after the money tonight and we're going to get it. I'm sorry we had to shoot one of your buddies. He got off the other side of the train and he was armed. We shot him right down. Roach heard the man inside ask where the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Milwaukee, and the Federal Reserve Bank sacks were. Get busy, the bandit leader yelled. Throw out those reds and chuck them in the automobiles. A red, in the parlance of the mail service, is a sack containing money. The robbers were really well versed in the contents of the train and exactly where, when, and how to proceed. Willis Newton himself later recalled the moment in an interview. I said, punch out those windows up there, and Joe smashed them out with a shotgun. He had a bottle of formaldehyde, and I said, give me that. Then I told them, guys, if you ain't coming out in half a second, I'm going to throw a bottle of poison gas in there. Well, boy, they jerked that door open and there were 17 or 18 of them in there. I said, just drop your pistols as you come out here. They were mail clerks, but they nearly all carried pistols. Even the armed mail clerks made no effort to resist the thief's demands amid the sounds of gunfire and tear gas bombs. Roach continued in his testimony. They threw pouches out and had other clerks throw them out. Then someone outside called, we've got to hurry and get out of here. We've got a wounded man to look after. They had all of us clerks carry the mail pouches over to the waiting automobiles. As the bags were being transferred from the train cars to the trunks and back seats of the bandits' stolen Cadillacs, the gang discovered that the person who took Brent Glasscock's bullets was not a mail clerk at all, but one of their own, Doc Newton, who had wandered outside of his assigned position. Many years later, Doc described what happened. When the train reached the junction at Rondout, the train did not stop at the planned place, but moved down the track a ways. This threw the whole deal off and we became confused. Glasscock got spooked and ran by me. I asked him, where are you going? I guess he thought I was somebody else because he started shooting me. They found Doc where he had fallen. He had been shot through the jaw, the right hand, the shoulder, and twice in the side. He was in deep shock and great pain, but he still clutched his gun. They dragged him back, lifted him over a fence where he finally dropped his gun, and laid him in a getaway car on a bed of treasure sacks. The treasure sacks contained a haul of $2 to $3 million. The number of mail bags and the value of their contents vary by publication and source. But to put the value of the estimated haul in the context of the time, in January of 1924, John G. Shedd, who was then chairman of the board of directors of the Marshall Field and Company, tendered a gift of $2 million to the South Park Board for an aquarium to be built just east of Field Museum. The proposed aquarium was intended to be 2.5 times the size of New York's. In today's dollars, the hall would be valued between $36.5 million and $55 million. The bandits got everything they intended, but Doc Newton, bleeding on the mail pouches, was in peril of his life. Joe Newton described the getaway. So we left. I got in the back with Doc. He was conscious and bleeding like a stuck hog, and we were worried he was going to die. Then we went to our hideout about 60 or 70 miles. We slid the doors back, drove inside, and shut the doors. We got the mail sacks open, and we had a lot of money, but there wasn't much rejoicing because there was Doc, and we figured we'd lost him. Me and one of the other boys said we'd take him to Chicago and see about finding a doctor. We contacted another fellow we knew there, a beer runner. He located a doctor, and we took Doc over to the house of one of his hired men and carried him up there. The doctor came and treated him, gave him lots of shots, cleaned his wounds out and everything. The first doctor had to leave, so James Murray called around to his underworld connections to find another. The bandits had driven 60 to 70 miles to a warehouse in Ottawa, Illinois to split the take. So Doc bled all the way from Rondout to Ottawa and all the way back to the West Side rooming house in Chicago after spending some time in the location where the thieves opened the mail sacks. Act 2, the chase. In the 20 minutes or so, the robbery took from first stopping the train to the last bag of loot being dropped into a getaway car. One of the trainmen had persuaded the leader of the thieves to let him walk to the Rondout station to alert Milwaukee that the number 57 train had stopped. He said it was necessary to prevent a collision with another Milwaukee-bound train. His phone message to the Milwaukee train dispatcher rang alarm bells all over northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. The Milwaukee office paged Lawrence J. Benson, General Superintendent of Police for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Rail Line. Benson arrived just 1 hour after the train was forced to an abrupt stop. Shortly after he arrived, Benson was greeted by the super sleuth of the Postal Inspection Service, William J. Fahey, who was eager to get started searching the area for evidence. As soon as word of the holdup was flashed to Chicago, 6 cars filled with detectives set out to watch the roads into the city. A warning was also sent to police and sheriffs between Chicago and Milwaukee. Within an hour, local police blocked all major roads through Lake County. Benson received a message from Michael Hughes, the chief postal inspector. Inspector Hughes told Benson he was working to locate Star Postal Inspector William J. Fahey to dispatch him to assist Benson in this investigation. Benson assured Hughes that Fahey was already on site working the scene. Benson and Fahey worked together to gather evidence. They found 2 discarded gas masks, a gun, the one dropped by Doc as he was being carried over the fence, and 2 quart bottles filled with unknown fluids. Benson sniffed one bottle and got a whiff of formaldehyde gas. The 2 also found blood, a lot of blood, left behind by Doc Newton. There was so much that investigators were certain the injured person must be dead. Benson and Fahey drove off together in the direction they believed the bandits made their escape. Fahey suggested they search each barn and structure that they drove past because he believed the thieves were likely to be hiding out nearby. Benson and Fahey cruised the county in vain until 6 a.m. when they returned to the area for breakfast in Libertyville.
Chicago detectives started their investigation by rounding up the usual suspects for these type of crimes, including a man named Carlo Fontana and his pals, all of whom had been under suspension in connection with a recent mail robbery at Harvey, Illinois, which is one of the mail robberies that William Fahey was lauded for solving. Other postal inspectors canvassed area gangsters and lawbreakers, one of whom gave them a valuable tip that an underworld doctor was treating someone for gunshot wounds at a local tenement house owned by Walter McComb at 53 Washington Avenue, which you can see on the map here. In his 1970s interviews, Willis Newton said that envy drove the locals to report what they knew. He said when law enforcement, quote, went to grabbing these hoodlums, they snitched because they were mad that they weren't smart enough or gutsy enough to pull off such a big heist. Maybe Willis was right, and the hoodlums who squealed did so because they wished they had been so clever. It seems more likely that they told what they knew because they didn't want to be hassled or arrested for a crime that they didn't commit. There are conflicting reports of who tipped off the police. If it was Carlos Fontano, then leading police directly to the Rondout robbers that night wasn't enough to save the snitching hoodlums. Carlos and his brother Ernest were both arrested under early suspicion of their involvement in the train robbery. Ernest stayed 3 months in the Kane County Jail on the charges until he was released in September of 1924 on a $100,000 bond, and he began to serve as an informant for the case. The U.S. Postal Inspection Service history of the train robbery reports that Dion O'Banion, a notorious gangster and rival of Al Capone in the bootlegging wars, was among the first questioned about the robbery, and that it was he who pointed inspectors to the apartment where the wounded man was being cared for. Whoever it was, it prompted Chicago detectives, including Chief William Shoemaker, to wait outside the Washington address until they saw a man dressed like a Westerner entering the property. Police entered the apartment and found a man who identified himself as J.H. Wayne. And I haven't actually looked up to see if John Wayne was the person with the note to that point yet, but it's kind of a nice coincidence. Suffering from bullet wounds. Sergeant Tapscott, who broke into the apartment, picked Wayne at once as the bandit known to have been shot at the Rondout robbery. So within 24 hours of the bandits executing their raid, law enforcement already had suspects in custody. Those arrested included 3 of the Newton brothers, Willis, Joe, and Doc, also known as Wiley or Willie sometimes in newspaper articles. All 3 used aliases. Doc went to Cook County Hospital instead of police headquarters that night to care for his many gunshot wounds. Jesse Newton, the other brother, had already headed to Texas on his way to Mexico immediately after the robbery. So he was not with his brothers at the West Side.
According to reporter and documentarian Claude Stanish, few of Willis's convictions were stronger throughout his life than that which told him that the system is infinitely corruptible. He genuinely believed that he was just one thief stealing from another. Expecting that Sergeant Tapscott could be persuaded with a bribe, Willis offered him $20,000 to let him run. Whether Tapscott would have agreed to the arrangement like Willis believes he would have, the presence of other detectives, including Chief William Shoemaker, killed any chance for that bribe to work. So under interrogation, which according to both Joe and Willis included severe beatings, Willis further misled the police by naming outlaws he hadn't worked with in decades as Rondout co-conspirators. He claimed that he and these men, Sam Grant and Harry Wilcox, planned to meet up in St. Louis to split the loot and suggested the police should take him to St. Louis so he could lead them to Grant and Wilcox. Police added Grant, Wilcox, and another man, Max Greenberg, one of the leaders of a St. Louis gang called Egan's Rats, to their suspect list. The Newton boys' Chicago connection, James Murray, was also taken into custody that night, also using an alias. Murray was at McComb's flat with the Newtons. McComb and Murray knew each other because McComb was Murray's driver. Mrs. Catherine McComb, Walter's wife, confirmed for the police that the injured train robber was in her West Side rooming house. Mrs. McComb, who was believed to have no part of the crime, was among those in the house, and she told all she knew. She thought to shield her husband by telling who did the crime, what she heard, and whom she heard say it. There was a lot of law enforcement activity, but it was not necessarily a well-coordinated effort between the agencies working on it. On June 17th, 5 days after the robbery, the Chicago Tribune headline read that Doc Brown had been put in the cell as a mail robber and that Cassane, a war vet, is now sought. Doc Brown was picked up for Rondout because he was suspected as the mastermind of a recent $1 million safe deposit burglary. Cassane was a known associate of Murray's. The article lists others believed to be involved in the Rondout train robbery. After detailing the recent arrests and who else was on the wanted list, the article introduced a bit of the disconnection between the investigating agencies. It said postal inspectors say they have no information as to what the Chicago police have learned. The robbery did not occur in Chicago nor in Cook County, but the Chicago police had the only prisoners and all of the information. Postal inspectors, while denying that there was any antagonism with the local police, were inclined to be dubious about the progress made. Meanwhile, while his brothers were in police custody, Jess Newton remained at large for some time. He headed straight to Mexico after the robbery, where, according to Willis, he stayed drunk day and night, day and night. He was drinking long before he got to Mexico. He stopped in San Antonio and buried his share of the loot right outside the city. Differing reports say Jesse's share was 4,000 or 5,000 or 35,000 or maybe 40,000. Whatever the amount, he buried it while drunk and could never again locate his buried treasure. A couple of undercover inspectors partied with Jesse in Mexico, checking the serial number on every dollar bill he paid with. They were trying to bust him and bring him back to the States, but none of the bills he used matched anything the train looked. According to the Chicago Tribune, Jesse was known for the strength of his back, but seemed to lack corresponding mental breadth. Having spent time with Jess, the investigators must have agreed. They devised a trick to appeal to his vanity in order to lure him out of Mexico. They knew Jesse believed himself to be the very best of all time at busting drunks. So investigators circulated placards announcing the prize of $500 for the rider who could stay on an unbroken horse at a fictitious rodeo and called Jesse's attention to them. Jesse bought a fancy new rodeo outfit and re-entered the United States at Del Rio, where he was promptly nabbed by postal inspectors. He wore his costume back to Chicago and enjoyed popularity among the newspaper cameramen who nicknamed him the Goof. So while they were chasing for the perpetrators, investigators were also working to recover the loot. Between the time of the heist and the trials, they had recovered $1,247,000 from various Midwest locations. On June 19th of 1924, police raided the home of a woman named Dolly Oglesby in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where they found 246 $20 bills believed to be part of the loot. Dolly Oglesby was one of the Newton boys' sisters. About a week later, police found an abandoned car in Joliet, Illinois, containing 62 registered mail pouches that had been cut open and emptied. One Rondout bag was missing. One of the slash bags had not been completely emptied. It contained $152,000 in negotiable bonds and $3,000 in certificates of common stock. On July 2nd, when Herbert Holliday was arrested in Little Rock while driving an expensive new car, he surrendered $21,000 in bonds and $6,825 worth of unset diamonds. Another $99,000 in Liberty bonds was discovered in a rural delivery mailbox about 10 miles outside of Little Rock. When Glasscock was arrested, he gave info that led to some of the loot in Kansas City at the home of innocent friends and around $500,000 buried in Wilmette, Illinois, and another $450,000 more in Tulsa. Months later, $46,000 in bonds were found in Cleveland, where a lawyer had placed them in escrow to aid a business project. Prosecutors displayed $1,247,000 worth of recovered cash, bonds, and jewelry at the trials. And we know another $340,000 was turned over years after the trials. Based on that, an estimated $1,600,000 was recovered. And 3, the sting. So even though the Chicago police had several people in custody, the investigation continued. Larry Benson continued to confer and work with William Fahey. Benson knew that even with the help from Murray, Glasscock, and Holliday, the thieves knew way too many details of the mail train's specific contents to not have had insider information. Murray, Glasscock, Holliday, and the Newtons just did not have access to and could not have known the level of details the thieves had when they demanded the bags by name. Benson tried to talk himself out of his growing suspicion that he knew the insider responsible for the largest train heist in U.S. history quite well. He really didn't want to believe the bad guy was none other than Star Postal Inspector William Fahey. Benson's hunch hit him in his first interactions with Fahey. So right after their Libertyville breakfast, Benson began investigating Fahey's movements, and time schedule for the day of the robbery. He learned that after number 57 had pulled out of Union Station, Fahey had gone directly to his office in the post office. He remained there just a few minutes and then commandeered a car and driver for his trip to Rondout. Benson said it seemed as if Fahey had started to investigate the crime before it had been committed. According to Benson, within 48 hours of the robbery, he was ready to test his hunch about Fahey. So Benson invited Fahey to accompany him to St. Louis with Willis Newton to take Willis to that loot-splitting meeting Willis invented for his interrogation. In 1952, the Chicago Tribune interviewed Larry Benson and reported the details of this trip. On the night of June 14th, Benson and Fahey took Willis Newton in handcuffs and shackles on a hot and tedious train ride to St. Louis. Benson never permitted Fahey to have a single word with Newton that he did not overhear, later described as a feat of vigilance involving various discomforts. At one point in St. Louis, Newton was unshackled. The robber was not acting unruly, but Fahey suddenly said to Benson, "Get your rod out, Larry. This so-and-so may try a breakaway." Perhaps Willis thought Fahey intended to kill him on the excuse of an attempted escape. Willis rolled toward Fahey. "You ought to be in handcuffs yourself." On the drive to the meetup spot, Newton told Benson that this was all a wild goose chase. Newton admitted that he had lied about the meeting. But then he added, "I guess it might be a good time for a meeting of the gang at that. Maybe you haven't guessed it, Larry, so I'll give it to you straight. You are taking this trip with 2 of the Rondout robbers." Benson's first test of Fahey certainly strengthened his suspicions. An interesting note in later interviews with Willis, he expressed disappointment that the police never took him up on his little St. Louis trick. So a little inconsistency in the memories of the people involved. While investigating his own investigative partner, Benson learned that as Fahey's professional reputation soared, his personal life was becoming increasingly messy. Fahey's beloved first wife passed away in 1920, and according to John Mark's book, The Silent Investigators, with her gone, he was like a man lost. He then made the mistake of marrying a cashier from a Chicago restaurant that he had hired as a housekeeper. Fahey was bitterly disillusioned when she failed to measure up to his first wife, and he took to heavy drinking. He began to hang out with fast, flashy women associated with crooked cops involved in all kinds of payoffs. And in particular, he took up with James Murray, a partner in a beer and rum syndicate and a dealer in stolen property. It was easy money for Fahey to ride a postal truck loaded with bootleg liquor as a safe escort from police inspection. More and more, he loved to surround himself with pretty and well-upholstered women. He became a lavish spender in nightclubs and was clearly living well above his $3,500 a year salary as a postal inspector. Colleagues had noticed Fahey's struggle after his wife's death and in his new marriage. They also saw the turning point in 1923 when he began wearing lavish styles and flaunting new income. Fahey told a few of his questioning colleagues that he had entered into the whiskey business with James Murray. This put him on his colleagues' radar as Murray had a bad reputation among law enforcement. One of the women whom Fahey coveted was a statuesque brunette named Florence, who was associated with notorious gangsters and was the wife of Big Tim Murphy, who was convicted of one of the mail robberies that Fahey was credited with solving. To make sure Big Tim remained behind bars while Fahey pursued Mrs. Murphy, he secured an indictment in federal court charging Murphy with complicity in a mail robbery at Pullman, Illinois. In August, Benson set a final trap for Fahey, sending him a telegram with false information. Fahey was trailed after he received this message. He left the post office building, went across Dearborn Street to the Great Northern Hotel, and used a public telephone man. His voice was heard, recognized, and recorded as he communicated the message to James Murray. Fahey was arrested on August 26th. Fahey told arresting officers they had it all wrong. He declared that Murray had been a boyhood chum and a source of valuable information against the underworld. These details he revealed while he was being arrested were all true.
Act 4, the trial. Law enforcement caught up with Herbert Holiday in July. Once Fahey was in custody in August, only Glasscock remained on the land. Glasscock was finally captured in September when he checked into a Battle Creek, Michigan sanitarium seeking treatment for a stomach ailment. And though Glasscock had checked in under an assumed name, the teenage son of the sanitarium's owners recognized the family's newest guest from his wanted poster. Holiday and Glasscock both admitted their involvement when they were arrested. More than 90 subpoenas were issued in advance of the trial. The subpoenas included demands for registration records documenting the value of mail in each pouch, the gas masks and formaldehyde and nitroglycerin bottles found at the scene, Chicago hotel registration records, telephone records at specific addresses, and the contents of Willis and his wife Louise's safe deposit box. The United States versus James Murray et al. Trials began in November 1924, just 5 months after the crime. On November 15, 1924, Chicago Daily Tribune reported, quote, "Government yesterday swept aside the mist that has covered the details of the mail robbery despite its solution and turned the first of its spotlights of evidence full into the faces of 2 of 3 defendants on trial. The Newtons, who had already all pled guilty, were the first to testify. They named William Fahey and James Murray as 2 of the 3 who did the planning. In this offense, Murray leaned into his bootlegger business, insisting that was the only crime that he was up to. Fahey also denied his involvement. He blamed jealous fellow inspectors for framing him, declaring that everything he did was designed to infiltrate the gang to solve the case, and that his connections across the underworld allowed him to solve major mail robberies. When questioned, Fahey did admit that he had telephoned the message to Murray, but that he had done this in the hope that Murray would try to move the loot, and he could then trail him and recover it and get credit that would come from doing that work. But evidence shows that Fahey never followed Murray and never assigned anyone else to follow him. Brent Glaftalk, who had confessed to his role in the heist, was brought into court next. He testified that he plotted with Murray dozens of times and stated that Murray waved goodbye to the robbers as they boarded the train they were planning to rob. Herbert Holliday refused to testify. On November 25th, 1924, just 10 days after the trial began, the Chicago Tribune headline revealed the verdicts, which had come in at 1:10 a.m. Convict, PO inspector, he and Murray guilty of huge mail robbery. 6 others confess, McComb free. So the driver got off. Fahey, Murray, and Holliday were each sentenced to 25 years. Because the Newtons agreed to testify against Fahey and Murray, their sentences were shorter. Willis and Doc got 12 years, Joe 3 years, and Jesse just 1 year and 1 day. The reason Jess received such a light sentence was reported to have been because the train engineer gave such sympathetic testimony at the trial. He said that when Jess had approached him with demands to stop the train, Jess had smiled and said, "Isn't this a hell of a way to make a living?" Murray maintained his innocence during the first few years in prison until he realized he could negotiate an earlier release date in exchange for revealing where investigators could recover that $340,000 that we mentioned earlier. Fahey maintained his innocence throughout the trial, throughout his incarceration, and until his death. He steadfastly refused offers of commutation if he would confess, and because of this, he stayed in prison 7 years longer than he really needed to. He could have been released early like the others if he had only admitted to his role in the heist. One of the judges said he believed that Fahey had served the 7 additional years, so he could always say to his son that he went to prison for a crime he didn't commit. But oftentimes a big event happens and that's the end of it. But we like to add an epilogue, and we wanted to know what happened to the main players past the events of 1924. So over the years, the Newton brothers emerged as villain celebrities. They were listed in the Album of Gunfighters, published in 1951. But Willis took exception to the book's claim that he and his brothers were daring and desperate outlaws who had engaged in many gun battles with the law. In an interview, Willis said, "We never wanted to hurt people. That's why we usually robbed banks at nighttime when there was nobody around. You couldn't go into them big city banks and rob them because there was policemen all around and burglar alarms even in those days. You had to go to the little ones. Wherever there are lots of people around, you run into too much chance of killing or hurting someone." Herbert Holliday died 7 years to the day after the Rondout train robbery. He was shot while attempting to steal 5 tires. James Murray served 5.5 years of his term. A few years after his release, he was convicted of a bank robbery in Pennsylvania. Jess served 9 months at Leavenworth. He worked on ranches around Uvalde, Texas, until he died in 1960 of lung cancer at the age of 73. He never found the loot he buried. Doc survived his wounds. After serving a little over 6 years, he did odd jobs, got married and divorced, and according to sources, drank a lot. In 1968, at age 77, he was arrested for robbing a bank, which made national news and was later the subject of an article in Life magazine. He claimed he got restless in the nursing home and just had to get back to business. "I have had my last fling," Newton said to reporters. Doc died in 1974 of cancer at the age of 83. In 1975, Willis and Joe participated in a documentary film and then a more in-depth oral history project. In the interviews, Joe said, "Lots of things have been written about us since the Rondout robbery, but most of it was either wrong or hearsay. We're the only ones who knew everything that happened because we were the only ones that took part in it. Joe returned to the straight life after serving 3 years for his role at Rondout. He married and raised a family and was, according to Willis, a good Baptist. According to reporter Claude Stanish, Joe always maintained that his career as a train robber had been a mistake, but he obviously enjoyed the local and national notoriety it brought him. Until 2 years before his death, he took part each year in the Texas Folklife Festival in San Antonio, signing autographs for wide-eyed kids, at the same time warning them not to follow him into his career. In 1980, a then 79-year-old Joe Newton, was a guest on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Viewers described him as charming, and that clip is actually on YouTube, and I recommend you go and watch it because it is quite interesting. After Willis served 4 years and 2 months for his role in the Rondout heist, he spent 6 months at Mayo Clinic to treat abdominal pain. His wife Louise picked him up from Mayo Clinic, and he went legit for a while, kind of, at least on the surface. He was able to buy a bit of land in Tulsa where he built a filling station. He also built and ran some nightclubs, and he owned that property for 43 years. Along the way, he was arrested here and there for various offenses. In the early 1960s, Willis served a year for kidnapping a man who he believed stole his late wife's jewelry. Willis died on August 22nd, 1979, at the age of 90. Joe died 10 years later on February 3rd, 1989. He was 88 years old. Lawrence Benson spent 47 years working for the railroads. For most of that time, he had worked as a railroad policeman or investigator before retiring in 1957. Benson had actually become a Libertyville resident at the end of the 1920s, eventually living at 346 Burdick. We have a picture of that house here, which is still standing. He passed away in 1961 at the age of 71. William Fahey was released in 1937 after serving 13 years. After his release, he was given employment as an investigator of accidents for a streetcar company. He passed away in 1943 at about 60 years of age. In 1994, Willis and Joe Newton added published author to their resumes after their death, when writer-reporter Claude Stanish and author David Middleton used the material from Stanish's 1975 documentary to write a book titled The Newton Boys, Portrait of an Outlaw Gang. The book transcribed the brothers' interviews, and that book served as the basis for an all-star movie in 1998, The Newton Boys, starring Matthew McConaughey. Stanish eked out a little more of the story in 2003, partnering with his daughter Michelle on a book called All Honest Men, a biographical novel, described as a fictionalized account of the life of J. Willis Newton and his brothers, told from the Newtons' point of view. Still more people are writing about the story. In 2013, author G.R. Williamson self-published his book, Willis Newton, The Last Texas Outlaw, based on taped interviews with Willis from the 70s. And in 2020, author W.C. Jamison published The Last Train Robber, The Life and Times of Willis Newton. And Jamison said, Newton's accounts were filled with bradagio, embellishment, and self-aggrandizement. Willis considered himself a professional on par with corporate executives. He once stated that all we wanted was the money, just like doctors, lawyers, and other businessmen. Robbing banks and trains was our way of getting it. That was our business. So there's several mysteries, or at least what we don't feel we can give you a definitive account of about the train robbery, especially around some of the key aspects. And the biggest was how much was stolen and how much was recovered. But while the Tribune described the robbery as the richest of all such exploits and loot, our research did not uncover this definitive authoritative source for the total amount. And another open question is the amount that has been recovered. So beyond the $4 or $35 or $40,000 that Jesse could never find again near San Antonio, how much money is still missing? Some news reports stated it has all been recovered. Others claim up to 1.5 million remains lost. But without a firm total on how much was stolen, how much could still be at large is impossible to determine. And it's also unclear who is the actual mastermind of the plot to rob the fast mail train. Some articles point to Fahey as the one who, desperate for money, used his knowledge of the mail train hauls and all of his insights from his investigations to devise the scheme and put together the team, using his underworld friend James Murray's connections to do the job. Other sources suggest James Murray was the mastermind, that he manipulated his boyfriend chum, Will Fahey, into providing the insider information, knowing that Fahey's lavish spending and downward spiral would make him unable to say no to a windfall. A 1952 Tribune article reviewing the heist named Fred Glasscock as the mastermind, saying that the Newton brothers served under the leadership of two older and smarter outlaws, Holiday being the other one. Glasscock testified that he insisted that Murray's tipsters stop wasting their time with mail trucks and give them something worth the effort. Of course, Willis claims it was his idea. He said the idea of robbing the train occurred to him after his acquaintance, James Murray, connected him to a Chicago tipster who told him about mail trucks. Willis said, "We went down there one night and watched the trucks, 6 or 7 of them, one right behind the other. Every one of them loaded mail onto that train." So the next time Willis met with the tipster, he said, "If we wait until it's loaded on the train, we can get every one of them and be out in the country and do it. So how about we rob the train?" He claims the tipster was against robbing the train, so Willis planned the robbery with his brothers and Brent Glasscock. He says, "So we went to work studying the train, where it went out, where it went to Milwaukee, the best place to stop it, where and how they loaded it at night. We worked on that for, I guess, 2 months." But Joe Newton told a different story. He said, "All we needed to do was to show up with one of our guns and our fast cars and follow orders. You can't lose when you've got a real life cop bossing the job," referring to James Murray. He went on, "It had to be the work of an insider, somebody smarter even than Willis." I hope he didn't say that in front of Willis. So to wrap up, the Rondout train robbery is a local historical event which captured national attention at the time and still piques people's interest today, evidenced by all of you here tonight. The amount stolen, the potential for some of the loot to be still at large, and the speed at which the perpetrators were captured, tried, and convicted, and then the roaring 20s of Chicago grabs at one's imagination. And while a definitive counting of the events and the loot may never be possible, we hope you've both been educated and entertained this evening. And if you ever come across new information on the aspects of the crime or any of the loot, we'd love to hear about it.